What if the most powerful ruler in Europe lost nearly everything and still managed to terrify an entire continent one last time? Imagine returning home after the greatest military disaster in modern history. Your legendary army is gone. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers have disappeared in the frozen wastes of Russia. Your allies are losing faith. Your enemies are preparing for revenge. And for the first time in more than a decade, the world believes you can be beaten. For most rulers, this would have been the end. For Napoleon Bonaparte, it became the beginning of his greatest fight for survival. The years 1813 and 1814 would produce some of his most brilliant victories, his greatest mistakes, the largest battle Europe had ever seen, and ultimately, the collapse of the empire he had spent years building. This is the story of Napoleon's last stand. When Napoleon returned to Paris in December 1812, after the disastrous Russian campaign, France faced a crisis unlike any since the Revolution. Only months earlier, the Grande Armée had crossed into Russia as the most powerful military force in Europe. Now, it barely existed. The catastrophe destroyed more than soldiers. It shattered the myth of French invincibility. Across Europe, rulers who had spent years obeying Napoleon suddenly sensed opportunity. The emperor understood the danger immediately. If his enemies united before he rebuilt his army, France could face a coalition larger than any he had ever encountered. So he launched one of the most remarkable military recoveries in history. New conscription classes were called up early. Thousands of young men were drafted. Veterans were recalled from Spain, Italy, and distant garrisons. Factories increased production, artillery was rebuilt, and supply networks were reorganized. Within months, Napoleon had assembled another massive army. Europe was astonished, yet appearances were deceiving. Many of these soldiers were inexperienced recruits. The veterans lost in Russia could not be replaced. Even worse was the shortage of cavalry. Tens of thousands of horses had perished during the retreat from Moscow. Without cavalry, Napoleon struggled to gather intelligence, track enemy movements, and exploit victories. Defeated armies that once would have been destroyed now managed to escape. Meanwhile, events in Prussia were transforming the political landscape. Ever since its crushing defeat at Jena in 1806, Prussia had waited for revenge. Military reforms had strengthened the army, and the people had never forgotten their humiliation. After Napoleon's disaster in Russia, the moment finally arrived. On February 28, 1813, Prussia allied itself with Russia. The Sixth Coalition was born. For the first time, a major European power openly committed itself to a war of liberation against France. King Frederick William III issued his famous appeal to "My people," and the response was extraordinary. Students volunteered, professors volunteered, merchants volunteered, farmers volunteered. Patriotism swept across Prussia. The conflict was no longer simply a war between governments. It was becoming a war between nations. Napoleon knew he could not allow his enemies time to gather strength. As always, his answer was speed. In the spring of 1813, he marched into Saxony, hoping to defeat the coalition before Austria decided which side to support. The first major clash came at Lutzen on May 2nd. Believing Napoleon's new army was vulnerable, coalition commanders launched a surprise attack. For hours, fierce fighting raged around several villages. The battle hung in the balance. Then, Napoleon did what he had done throughout his career. He concentrated overwhelming force at the decisive point. Fresh troops arrived. Artillery batteries were repositioned. French attacks intensified. By evening, the Russians and Prussians were retreating. Napoleon had won his first major victory since Russia. But the battle exposed serious weaknesses. French losses were heavy. Marshal Bessières, one of Napoleon's trusted commanders, had recently been killed. And once again, the lack of cavalry prevented an effective pursuit. The enemy escaped largely intact. 3 weeks later, another opportunity appeared. At Bautzen, Napoleon attempted to trap and destroy the coalition army. His plan called for Marshal Ney to strike the enemy's flank while the main French force attacked from the front. For much of the battle, everything seemed to be working. Coalition positions came under intense pressure. A decisive victory appeared within reach, but at the crucial moment, coordination failed. Ney did not arrive in the right place at the right time. The coalition commanders recognized the danger and withdrew before the trap could close. Once again, Napoleon had won the battlefield. Once again, his enemies survived, and that difference would change the course of the war. The summer of 1813 brought Napoleon an opportunity that would later haunt him. After the battles of Lutzen and Bautzen, both sides agreed to an armistice. At first, the pause seemed sensible. The French army needed rest. Supply lines required repair. Most importantly, Napoleon desperately needed time to rebuild his cavalry. But while France paused, the coalition prepared. And no one understood the situation better than Austrian Foreign Minister Clemens von Metternich. Austria had suffered repeated defeats at Napoleon's hands, yet it remained one of Europe's great powers. Metternich hoped to preserve peace while restoring the balance of power. Throughout the summer, he attempted to negotiate a compromise. The terms were surprisingly generous. Napoleon would remain Emperor of France. France would remain a major European power, but the empire would have to surrender many of its conquered territories. For most rulers, it would have been an acceptable deal. For Napoleon, it was unacceptable. During a famous meeting between the two men, Metternich warned the emperor that Europe was no longer willing to tolerate French domination. Napoleon refused to compromise. Whether driven by confidence, pride, or a genuine belief that victory remained possible, he rejected the proposal. The negotiations collapsed. The consequences were immediate. On August 12, 1813, Austria declared war on France. Everything changed. Napoleon was no longer fighting Russia and Prussia alone. Austria joined the coalition. Britain continued to provide enormous financial support. Sweden entered the war under Crown Prince Bernadotte, a former French marshal who had once served under Napoleon himself. For the first time, the emperor faced an alliance with overwhelming manpower and resources. The coalition leaders, however, had learned an important lesson from years of warfare. Defeating Napoleon directly was dangerous. History had proven that, again and again. Instead, they adopted a new strategy known as the Trachenberg Plan. Its idea was simple, but brilliant. Avoid major battles with Napoleon whenever possible. Attack his marshals. Attack isolated French forces. Use superior numbers to wear down the empire, piece by piece. The strategy worked. Throughout the late summer, French armies suffered defeats at Grossbeeren, Katzbach, Kulm, and Dennewitz. Even when Napoleon personally won battles, the overall strategic situation continued to deteriorate. The empire was bleeding strength. Every victory seemed to cost more than it gained. Then came the battle that would determine the future of Germany. In October 1813, armies from across Europe converged on the city of Leipzig. What followed became known as the Battle of Nations. At the time, it was the largest battle in human history. More than 500,000 soldiers would participate over 4 days of fighting. The scale was almost unimaginable. Entire landscapes disappeared beneath clouds of smoke. The roar of artillery echoed across the countryside. Massive infantry formations stretched to the horizon. Thousands of cavalrymen maneuvered across fields already littered with casualties. Napoleon commanded roughly 190,000 troops. The coalition would eventually deploy more than 300,000. On October 16th, the battle began. Fighting erupted across multiple fronts at once. French troops launched fierce counterattacks. several coalition formations were pushed back. For brief moments, it seemed as though Napoleon might achieve another impossible victory. But unlike previous campaigns, every passing hour brought new enemy reinforcements. The coalition simply had more soldiers, more reserves, more resources, and more time. The fighting intensified on October 17th and 18th. Villages changed hands repeatedly. Artillery duels raged without interruption. Casualties climbed into the tens of thousands. Then Napoleon suffered a devastating blow. Several Saxon units fighting within the French army suddenly defected to the coalition. French soldiers watched former allies turn their guns against them. The psychological impact was enormous. It symbolized a larger reality. Napoleon's alliance system was collapsing. Across Germany, many states no longer believed France could win. By the evening of October 18th, the emperor faced an unavoidable truth. Leipzig could not be held. A retreat was necessary. During the night, French forces began withdrawing westward. At first, the operation proceeded in good order. Then, disaster struck. On October 19th, the main bridge over the Elster River was destroyed too early. Thousands of French soldiers became trapped inside the city. Chaos erupted. Some attempted to swim across the river. Many drowned. Others were captured. Among the dead was Prince Józef Poniatowski, one of Napoleon's most loyal allies and commanders. When the battle finally ended, French losses exceeded 70,000 men. The coalition had also suffered terrible casualties, but unlike France, it could replace them.
Fire at will, men! Hold formation! Push forward!
Leipzig was more than a defeat. It was a turning point. Napoleon lost control of Germany. The Confederation of the Rhine began to collapse. Former allies abandoned him. One by one, the pillars supporting his empire crumbled. For the first time in years, the war was moving directly toward French territory. The empire had survived the disaster in Russia, but now it faced an even greater threat. An entire continent was marching against Napoleon, and the final campaign was about to begin. As 1814 began, Napoleon faced the most dangerous situation of his entire career. For more than a decade, war had been fought far from the heart of France. Battles had been won in Italy, Austria, Prussia, Spain, Poland, and Russia. Now, for the first time since the Revolutionary Wars, enemy armies were preparing to invade France itself. The psychological impact was enormous. Many French citizens had grown up knowing only victory. Many could not imagine foreign soldiers marching through their homeland. Yet that nightmare was becoming reality. From multiple directions, coalition armies crossed France's borders. The main Allied forces were commanded by some of Europe's most experienced generals. Field Marshal Karl von Schwarzenberg led the Army of Bohemia, while Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher commanded the Army of Silesia. Together, they possessed several 100,000 soldiers. Napoleon had only a fraction of their numbers. His resources were exhausted. His empire was collapsing. His enemies seemed unstoppable. And yet, what happened next remains one of the greatest demonstrations of military genius in history. Most commanders would have retreated toward Paris and prepared for defeat. Napoleon chose to attack. He understood that although the coalition armies were larger, they were spread across a vast area and often struggled to coordinate their movements. If he could move fast enough, he might defeat isolated enemy forces before they could support one another. It was a strategy he had used many times before, but now the fate of France depended on it. In February 1814, Napoleon launched what historians would later call the 6 Days Campaign. Even today, military academies study it as a masterpiece of operational warfare. On February 10th, Napoleon struck first at Champaubert. An isolated Russian corps found itself facing concentrated French forces. The result was devastating. The enemy formation was shattered, and thousands were captured. The very next day, Napoleon attacked again at Montmirail. Once more, he achieved local numerical superiority. French troops drove the coalition forces backward and secured another victory. The campaign continued at breathtaking speed. On February 12th, Napoleon pursued the retreating enemy to Château Thierry and inflicted further losses. Then, on February 14th, came the Battle of Vauchamp. There, Napoleon delivered perhaps the most complete victory of the campaign. French cavalry relentlessly pursued the retreating enemy, turning defeat into disaster. In just 6 days, Napoleon had defeated multiple coalition corps and stunned Europe. News of the victories spread rapidly. For a brief moment, people began asking an extraordinary question. Could Napoleon actually save his empire? Even his enemies were impressed. Yet reality remained unforgiving. Napoleon could win battles. He could destroy corps. He could even defeat armies. But he could not replace the soldiers France had already lost. Every victory cost valuable manpower. Every battle consumed resources that could no longer be replenished. Meanwhile, coalition reinforcements continued arriving from Russia, Prussia, Austria, and their allies. The balance of power remained overwhelming. Recognizing this, the coalition leaders changed their strategy. Instead of chasing Napoleon across eastern France, they decided to target what mattered most: Paris. The French capital was more than a city. It was the political heart of the empire and the symbol of Napoleon's rule. If Paris fell, everything else might collapse with it. While Napoleon maneuvered in the countryside, coalition armies advanced steadily toward their objective. The emperor attempted to threaten their communications and supply lines, hoping to force them to turn back. In earlier campaigns, such maneuvers had often worked. This time, the Allies refused to be distracted. Their goal remained unchanged: reach Paris, end the war. By late March, coalition forces were converging on the capital. The defenders faced overwhelming odds. Many were inexperienced recruits or National Guardsmen. Others were exhausted veterans, worn down by years of continuous warfare. On March 30th, 1814, the Battle of Paris began. French troops fought with determination. Artillery thundered across the hills surrounding the city. Coalition forces launched repeated assaults. For hours, fierce fighting raged, but numbers eventually decided the outcome. The defenders were simply outmatched. Position after position fell. By evening, further resistance seemed hopeless. The following day, Paris surrendered. For the first time in decades, foreign armies occupied the French capital. The symbolic impact was enormous. On March 31st, Tsar Alexander I of Russia, King Frederick William III of Prussia, and other Allied leaders entered Paris in triumph. The city that had once stood at the center of Napoleon's empire now belonged to his enemies. When Napoleon learned of Paris's fall, he rushed toward the capital, but it was already too late. The political foundations of his empire had collapsed. Even then, he considered continuing the war. Some plans involved retreating south and raising new armies. Others proposed continuing resistance through mobile operations. But one obstacle proved impossible to overcome. His own marshals no longer believed victory was possible. For years, these men had followed him across Europe. They had shared his victories and endured his defeats. Now they believed further fighting would only bring more suffering to France. Marshal Ney and several senior commanders urged Napoleon to accept reality. One by one, his closest military leaders withdrew their support. Without them, resistance became impossible. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon formally abdicated. The man who had dominated Europe for more than a decade surrendered his throne. The First French Empire had fallen. The victorious powers chose exile rather than execution. Napoleon was sent to the small Mediterranean island of Elba. Most Europeans believed his political career was over forever. Before leaving, however, he shared one final emotional moment with the soldiers who had remained loyal until the end. On April 20th, 1814, at Fontainebleau, Napoleon bid farewell to the old guard. These were not ordinary soldiers. They had marched with him across Europe. They had fought at Austerlitz. They had survived Russia. They had remained faithful through glory and disaster alike. As Napoleon addressed them, hardened veterans openly wept. Officers struggled to contain their emotions. An era was ending, an era that had transformed Europe and changed warfare forever. Soon afterward, Napoleon departed for Elba. Europe celebrated. Kings rejoiced. Diplomats gathered to reshape the continent. Most believed peace had finally arrived. Most believed Napoleon would spend the rest of his life in quiet exile. They were wrong, because while Europe celebrated, Napoleon was watching, waiting, planning, and across France, dissatisfaction with the restored monarchy was already growing. Within less than a year, he would escape Elba. He would return to France. An army sent to arrest him would instead join him. Europe would once again march to war, and Napoleon's fate would ultimately be decided on a battlefield in Belgium. A battlefield whose name would echo through history forever, Waterloo. But that is a story for the next chapter.